She didn't cry when her father told her. She just stood at the kitchen window and watched the last of the winter light disappear behind the ridge. And she thought, so this is how it ends. 31 years old, and Maeve Callister had already buried one life. She'd buried it in a courthouse in Nashville with a divorce decree and a stack of medical bills she'd be paying off until she was 50. Her mother's funeral had come 6 weeks later. Then the job. Then the apartment. Each thing falling away like cards from a bad hand, one by one, until there was nothing left to lose. Except her father's land. 60 acres in the foothills of eastern Tennessee. Stubborn red clay, a creek that flooded every spring, a barn that leaned a little more each year toward the ground. It wasn't much. But Walter Callister had worked it for 40 years, and his father before him, and when the stroke took the use of his right hand and most of his words, the bank had come knocking with a number Maeve couldn't make disappear no matter how many shifts she picked up at the diner in town. There's a man, her father's neighbor said. Not her father, he couldn't say much anymore, but Olin Pruitt, who'd farmed the adjacent land since before Maeve was born, and who had a habit of showing up with information nobody asked for. He'd said it the way people say things they already know you're going to argue with. Up on Harrow Creek. Name's Sutton Mast. Widower. Got good land, good cattle. He's been looking. Looking for what? Maeve said, though she already knew. A wife. Olin turned his hat in his hands. He's not bad people, Maeve. I've known him 15 years. He doesn't talk much. Lost his boy a few years back. Lost his wife before that. He keeps to himself. She stared at him. He's willing to settle the debt, Olin said. The whole thing. In exchange for, I heard you the first time. She told herself she'd sleep on it. She didn't sleep at all. By morning, she'd made a list of every other option. She called her brother in Phoenix, who owed her 4 years of missed Christmases and $1,000 from 2019. He picked up on the 6th ring, sounded distracted, said he was sorry, said he'd try to pull something together. She knew what that meant. She called the bank and spoke to a woman named Dottie, who was professionally sympathetic, and offered her a pamphlet about refinancing. She sat at her father's kitchen table with a legal pad and added up numbers until her eyes blurred. Then she called Olin back. Sutton Mast's property was up a long gravel road off Route 9, past a rusted mailbox with no name on it, past a cattle gate that needed a new latch. Maeve drove it on a Tuesday morning in February, the sky the color of dirty dishwater, ice still sheeting the north-facing ditches. She'd worn her good coat and put on lipstick in the rearview mirror, and then wiped half of it off, because she didn't know what she was trying to prove. The farmhouse was white, or had been once. It sat back from a stand of cedar trees, 2 stories with a covered porch running the length of the front. There was a truck parked beside the barn, and smoke coming from the chimney, and a dog lying on the porch steps who lifted its head, and then put it back down as she walked up. She knocked, nothing for a long moment. Then footsteps. Then the door opened. He was taller than she expected. Broad through the shoulders, dark-haired, with several days of stubble on his jaw, and eyes that were the particular shade of gray that made her think of overcast November. He was maybe 40, maybe a little older. He looked at her the way people look at something they're trying to figure out, without trying to hide the fact that they're figuring. "You're Maeve," he said. "I am." He stood back from the door. Not quite an invitation, but not a refusal either. She walked past him into a kitchen that smelled like wood smoke and coffee and something else she couldn't name. Worked leather, maybe. The cold brought in from outside. He poured 2 cups of coffee without asking and set one in front of her at the table. Then he sat down across from her and wrapped both hands around his own cup and looked at the surface of it. "Olin says your father's land is 60 acres, he said. 63, she said, and the house. Good well, creek access on the south end. The barn needs work, but the bones are solid, and the debt is $42,042.4. Slowly, she watched him. He had calloused hands, the kind that came from years of real work, not a few weekends with a hammer. His fingernails were clean. She noticed that too. "I'll pay it in full," he said. "Day of. And you'd live here, help manage the household. I'm not looking for a—" He paused, something moving behind his eyes. "A performance. I'm not looking for a woman to put on a show for the county. I need someone practical, steady. And in return, your father keeps his land. You keep your name, what's left of it." His voice was flat, not unkind. "I'm not asking for love, Miss Callister. I don't think either one of us has got a lot of that left to spare." She should have been offended. She found to her own surprise that she wasn't. I have conditions, she said. Something shifted in his face, almost curiosity. Go ahead, my father comes here. If his health keeps declining, I want him close. I'm not leaving him alone with a neighbor checking in twice a week. Fine. I want it in writing. What you're paying, what I'm providing, what the arrangement is. I've done things on trust before. She kept her voice even. I don't do things on trust anymore. He looked at her for a long moment. That's reasonable. And I want it understood. She stopped, chose her words carefully. I'm not a housekeeper you're hiring. I'm not a nurse. I'm coming into this as a partner in the practical sense. What needs doing, I'll do it. But I won't be managed. Sutton Mast was quiet for long enough that she thought she'd overstepped. Then he said, my wife used to say something like that, and he said it so quietly, so without armor that she felt something in her chest pull tight like a knot being drawn. All right, he said finally. We have a deal. He put his hand across the table. She shook it. His grip was firm and brief. Outside, the sky had turned darker. The dog hadn't moved from the porch steps. Maeve drove back down the gravel road, with both hands on the wheel and a feeling she couldn't entirely name. Not relief, not dread, something more complicated than either. They married on a Friday in March at the county clerk's office. 2 witnesses, Olin Pruitt and a woman from the clerk's staff who smelled like vanilla, and seemed genuinely moved by proceedings that were, by any measure, not moving. Maeve wore a blue dress she'd owned for 4 years. Sutton wore a clean shirt and looked like a man enduring something, which she supposed he was. They said what needed to be said. They signed what needed to be signed. The drive to Harrow Creek was quiet. He'd made up the spare room off the hall for her. There was a quilt on the bed, green and cream, and a lamp on the nightstand, and the window looked out over the cedar trees. He showed her without ceremony and said there were extra blankets in the closet if she got cold. She said thank you. He nodded once and went back downstairs. She sat on the edge of the bed for a while. She wasn't sad exactly. She just felt the strange hollowness of a thing decided, a door closed that couldn't be opened again. She was somebody's wife for the second time in her life, and she'd felt approximately nothing at the moment she became so, and she wasn't sure yet if that was a mercy or a warning. The first weeks were careful. Maeve learned the rhythms of the farm the way you learn a foreign language, slowly, by repetition, by making mistakes and correcting them. She learned that Sutton rose before dawn and was in the barn by 5:30 and didn't want coffee until he came in at 7. She learned that the feed was kept in the shed off the south side, not the big barn, and that the calving records were in the green binder on the shelf above the desk in what had been, at some point, a study, but was now mostly storage. She learned that he ate whatever she put in front of him, without comment, which she eventually decided was a compliment. He was not a difficult man to live around. He was just quiet, not cold, not hostile, but the kind of quiet that had weight to it, that told you something had happened inside it. There were photographs on the mantel. A woman, auburn-haired, laughing at something outside the frame. A small boy, maybe 4 years old, on a fence rail with his arms spread like wings. Maeve looked at them once and didn't look again. Her father came in April. Sutton had the downstairs bedroom set up for him, closer to the bathroom, handrails in all the right places. When Maeve brought Walter in and he stood in the doorway and looked around, something complicated happened in his face. Relief, she thought, or the shape of pride finally setting down what it had been carrying. He squeezed her hand with his good hand. She squeezed back. Sutton shook his hand and said he was glad to have him and meant it, she could tell. Her father looked at Sutton the way old men look at young ones they're trying to take the measure of. Then he looked at Maeve, and something passed between them that she chose not to examine too closely. It happened on a Wednesday in May, and it happened because of a calf. Maeve had been up since 4 with a heifer in distress. A first-time mother who'd decided the barn stall was not an acceptable venue and had gone down out in the east pasture in the rain. By the time she got to her, the calf was half out and wrong. And Maeve had done things with her hands she hadn't known she could do, and by 5:40 she was kneeling in wet grass in the dark with a living calf across her knees and mud up to her elbows. She heard Sutton behind her before she saw him. He'd come out after her, she realized. She'd been too focused to notice the light coming on in the house. He looked at her. He looked at the calf. He looked at her again. "You did that," he said. "She did most of it," Maeve said. "I just helped with the geometry." He crouched down beside her in the mud and checked the calf with hands that knew exactly what they were looking for. The heifer was already turning around, nervous and exhausted. He stayed there a while. Maeve stayed too. The rain had eased to a mist. "My wife," he said, not looking at her, she wouldn't go near them when they were calving. Said it made her feel helpless. A pause. She was good at other things. Maeve didn't say anything. Sometimes silence is the right answer. "I don't think you feel helpless much," he said. She thought about Nashville. About the year after everything fell apart, when she'd woken up at 2 in the morning, so many times she'd stopped fighting it and just sat at the kitchen table with the radio on low until daylight. "I did for a while," she said. "I got over it." He looked at her then. Really looked, she felt, rather than just registering her presence the way he usually did. The light was coming up gray in the east. She was covered in mud and probably looked like something dragged from a riverbed. "Come in," he said. "I'll make the coffee." It was such a small thing, but she thought about it more than once in the days that followed. She found the letter at the end of June. It was in the mailbox with a batch of other mail she'd picked up on her way back from town. Feed invoices, a seed catalog, a postcard from Olin, who'd gone to visit a cousin in Arkansas. The letter had no return address, but the postmark was Shelby County, and the handwriting was the deliberate, spaced kind of a person who wanted to be sure of being read. She didn't open it. It wasn't addressed to her. She set it on the desk in the study with the rest of the mail and forgot about it until she came in that evening and found Sutton standing at the window with the letter open in his hand and his back to the room. She would have left. But something in the line of his shoulders stopped her. Sutton. He turned. His face had gone very still, the way faces go when they're working too hard to show nothing. "There's a man named Greaves," he said. "Court Greaves. Out of Memphis. He used to work for a man I had dealings with years ago. Bad dealings." He folded the letter carefully along its original creases. "I thought it was finished." "What kind of dealings?" He sat down. She'd never seen him sit like that before, not the controlled, deliberate way he usually moved, but the way of a man whose body has decided to give up an argument. He told her. It took a while. The short version was this. 8 years ago, before the stroke of losses that had taken his wife and his son, Sutton had been a different kind of solvent. He'd run more cattle, better land, had brought in a partner for expansion. A man named Greaves who'd come with good references and bad intentions. Greaves had skimmed from the operation for 2 years before Sutton figured it out. When Sutton had taken it to the county attorney, Greaves had disappeared into a legal fog of cousins and lawyers and a judge in Shelby County who Sutton suspected had been reached. Nothing had come of it. Sutton had swallowed the loss, sold off the additional land, and spent 3 years rebuilding. Then his wife died. Then his boy. And Sutton Mast had closed himself into Harrow Creek and stopped expecting anything from the world. "He's out," Sutton said. "The letter's from someone who wants me to know. Greaves is out, and he's been talking. Asking questions about property values up here. Asking about whether I've got family." Maeve was quiet for a moment. "Does he know about?" "He knows I married." Olin told someone at the feed store. Word gets around. He looked at her. Something in his expression she hadn't seen before. "It might have been shame. I didn't think, when I made this arrangement, I didn't think there was anything for anyone to threaten. I thought I was past being someone with something to lose. Are you telling me I'm a liability? I'm telling you I might have put you in a position without meaning to." She considered him across the room. The dog was asleep in the corner. The clock on the wall ticked. Outside, the evening bugs were starting up in the field. "Sutton," she said, "I came here because I had nowhere else to go. I stayed because..." She stopped, surprised by what she'd almost said. "Because this works. What we have here. It works." She leveled her voice. "What do you need to do?" What he needed to do took most of the summer. It started with a drive to Nashville, Maeve's idea, because she still knew people there, from the years she'd worked in a paralegal office before her marriage, before her other life. She called in a debt from a woman named Carrie, who owed her approximately 3 years of favors, and Carrie connected them to a lawyer who specialized in exactly the kind of financial fraud that had happened to Sutton 8 years ago and gone nowhere. The lawyer's name was Deirdre Ashby, and she was small and precise, and had the kind of eyes that made you feel like she was already 6 moves ahead of whatever you were saying. She listened to Sutton for 45 minutes without writing anything down. Then she said, "You have documentation." "I have everything," Sutton said. "Good," Deirdre Ashby said, "because Greaves has done this twice more since you, and one of those men is very motivated and has very good memory." It moved slowly and then fast the way these things do. There were depositions. There were several weeks when Sutton checked the gate latch twice before coming in at night. There was a period when a truck Maeve didn't recognize made 3 passes on Route 9 in 1 week, and Sutton slept downstairs without saying why, and she pretended not to notice because she understood that some men protect by not explaining. She had her own bad nights. She lay awake in the spare room that had slowly accumulated her things: a book on the nightstand, her grandmother's mirror on the dresser, the blue coat on the hook behind the door. And she thought about the choices that had carried her here. She'd thought in her first life that she'd known what love was. She'd thought it was a feeling, sudden and declarative. Now she thought it might be something quieter, something that looked more like showing up in the rain, something that looked like coffee at 7 and a hand across a table and a man who checked the gate latch because he'd finally decided he had something worth protecting. She wasn't sure when she'd started to love him. She wasn't sure it had happened in a moment at all. Greaves was arrested in September, a Friday, which seemed fitting. Deirdre Ashby called at 8:30 in the morning and said 3 words. They have him, and Maeve sat down at the kitchen table and put her forehead on her arms for a moment, just a moment, while the relief moved through her. Sutton was in the barn. She walked out to tell him. He was mending a fence rail, the radio going on a shelf nearby, the cattle drifting in the south end of the pasture. She said it plainly. They have Greaves. Federal warrant. He's not getting out of this one. Sutton set down the fence tool. He didn't say anything for what felt like a long time. When he finally looked at her, his face was doing something she'd never seen it do. Not quite breaking. More like something being put down that had been carried too long. Okay, he said. That was all. Just okay. But he crossed the space between them and stood close enough that she could smell the cold morning on him, and he put his hand on the side of her face very briefly. Once, like something he'd needed to check was real, and she turned into it just slightly before he dropped his hand. Come in, she said. I'll make breakfast. He followed her back across the field. Her father got better in small ways through the fall. Not the stroke. That wasn't something that could be taken back. But he moved more easily, and his words came back in fits and starts like a radio station finding its frequency. He'd sit on the porch in the afternoons with the dog at his feet and watch the tree line, and sometimes Sutton would come and sit with him without there being any particular conversation, which Maeve suspected her father appreciated more than he could say. She caught them out there one evening at the end of October, the light going gold over the ridge, both of them looking west. Her father's good hand resting on the dog's head, Sutton with his coffee. Neither one talking. She stood in the doorway for a moment and didn't announce herself. She just watched them. The field, the fading light, the two of them comfortable in the kind of silence that only exists between people who have decided each other is safe. She thought, so this is how it begins. It was a Tuesday evening in November when things shifted in the way they'd been moving toward for a long while without either of them naming it. She'd been out checking the fence line on the east end and come back later than planned, the dark coming down fast the way it did in November, the temperature dropping. When she came into the kitchen, Sutton was at the stove with his back to her, and something smelled good. And the lamp on the table was on low and the radio was playing something instrumental, the kind of thing you don't put on when you're expecting company, but when you're just in a house that feels, suddenly, more like a home than you thought it would. He heard her come in. He didn't turn around immediately. Fence hold? He said. Mostly. The corner post needs attention in spring. I saw that. She hung her coat on the hook and washed her hands at the sink. She was aware of the room in a new way. The small of it, the warmth of it, the way two people's belongings had gradually mingled on the shelves and the table and the hooks by the door without anyone deciding it. Sutton, she said. He turned then. His expression was careful in that way he had. Not closed, just slow, like he'd learned to be deliberate with things that mattered. She didn't plan what she said next. She hadn't rehearsed it. She said, I think I'd like to stop pretending this is something other than what it is. He looked at her. What is it? A marriage, she said. A real one, if she stopped. Started again. If that's something you'd want. Something moved across his face that she recognized, because she'd felt it herself. The recognition of something you'd been cautious about for long enough that desire had started to feel like a reckless thing. He set down what he was holding. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her that morning in the east pasture. the dark and the rain and the new life between them. "Yeah," he said quietly. "It's something I'd want." There was no dramatic declaration, no sudden translation of everything into grand gesture. Sutton Mast was not a man given to speeches, and Maeve Callister, she'd kept her name. He hadn't asked her not to. Was not a woman given to believing them. What changed was simpler and more permanent. It was in the way he stopped excusing himself from the room when she was there, the way she stopped keeping count of what she owed and what she'd been given, the way they started moving through the same space without adjustment, without calculation, the way two people do when they have agreed, without quite saying so, that this is home. Her father noticed before she said a word. He gave her a look one morning over his coffee, a complicated look, warm and a little sad and proud all at once, and she gave him a look back that said, "I know," and that was that. Deirdre Ashby sent word in January that Greaves had taken a plea. 8 years, federal. Sutton read the letter at the kitchen table with Maeve beside him, and she watched him read it twice, folding and unfolding the paper with those calloused hands, and when he looked up his eyes were clear in a way she hadn't seen in the months she'd known him. 8 years, he said. "That's 8 years," she agreed. He set the letter down. He covered her hand with his. They sat like that for a while, in the kitchen that smelled like coffee and wood smoke, with the light coming in off the snow outside and the dog asleep in the corner, and her father still sleeping down the hall. Eventually she got up and made more coffee. He got up and went to the barn. The cattle needed feeding. The fence needed checking. The work never ended, and they were glad of it. The weight of it, the realness of it, the way it asked for all of you and gave you something back that had no name but that you recognized, finally, after everything, as the kind of life you hadn't dared to want. Outside, the fields lay still under the February sky. The cedar trees held their ground against the wind. The smoke rose from the chimney straight and quiet into the cold, pale morning.